Hey guys, it's J-Knight here. Ever since ARMS came out, I've been playing it constantly, and I'm having a ton of fun. And of course, I wouldn't be nearly having as much fun without playing my favorite character. Or should I say characters? I'm talking about Byte Barq after all. There's been a good deal of confusion and misconceptions about how they actually work. So if you're interested in playing them, or at least knowing how they even work at all, you're looking at the right video. Byte Barq are a tag team of two characters, a police bot and his mechanical canine. While they are quite flexible in playstyle, I'm going to focus on the strategies that have worked the best for me. Byte Barq, in my opinion, are best played as mid-range pressure characters, utilizing their ability to attack from several different angles, as well as close in or back up when needed, with their surprisingly good mobility options. They specialize in mix-ups and punishing grounded opponents with their setups. But to pull any of this off, you're going to need an in-depth understanding of the character's mechanics, because without knowing how to utilize Barq well, you might as well play any other character. Why is this the case though? Well, Byte himself doesn't have any special abilities. Also, even though his mobility is about as good as Springman's, his arm size is smaller and his body size is larger compared to Springman. This is why it's so important to learn all you can about Barq, because this is what gives their duo the edge in combat. When playing Byte Barq, Barq is basically your third arm. At first, you might assume that Barq punches randomly, or every few seconds, but that isn't the case at all. Just like any good companion, Barq is very reliable and synchronizes with Byte to determine what to do. For instance, Barq will always try to stay diagonally in front of you, and won't attack if you're too far from him. On top of that, Barq will also go directly in front of Byte when he is blocking. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about Barq's arm first. Barq's arm acts like a miniature toaster, being a medium weight arm and dealing 30 damage when it hits. It fires straight at the opponent and doesn't track them, but has a speed and range similar to the toaster as well. So, how do you know that Barq is going to punch? If you take Byte Barq into training and wait, you'll see Barq punch 5 seconds after the round starts. This is the perfect example of Barq's attack timer. When Byte attacks, Barq will start an attack exactly 1 second afterwards if he isn't doing any actions such as charging, blocking, jumping, or being jumped on. Once Barq attacks and his arm returns to him, then Barq will attack again 5 seconds later. This is because once Barq's arm returns to him, his attack timer is set to 5 seconds. To reiterate, punching and grabbing will make Barq attack 1 second later, and then set an attack timer for 5 seconds, after which he will attack once again. There are multiple interesting things about Barq's attack timer, and being able to delay both the initial punch and the second punch at the end of the timer. I'll go into specifics later, but just keep it in mind for now. One aspect of the attack timer is that it determines what Barq will do when Byte is knocked down. If Barq's attack timer is currently counting down, Barq will attack the opponent while Byte is on the ground. However, if Barq doesn't have his attack timer counting down, then he will not do this. Instead, when Byte gets up, Barq will attack immediately alongside Byte's first punch. A very important part of using Barq's punch is charging it. Again, you'll need to make sure Barq isn't doing any actions besides moving around for him to charge alongside Byte. When Barq is charged, his glove gains the fire element and deals 70 damage instead of 30. Another great thing about it is when Barq is charged and Byte punches, instead of waiting a second and then attacking, Barq will attack immediately alongside Byte. It's important to master this as it is the key to Byte Barq's ground pressure game. So, what are Barq's punches good for besides occasional small bits of damage? Well, first of all, you can do Barq confirms. If Barq hits an opponent, depending on how close you are, you can use the hit to get the opponent into a grab, or even a rush. The charged version of Barq's punch is very good at two things: attacking from both angles at the same time, and attacking and grabbing at the same time. Let's say you're going against an opponent who likes to block a lot. For example, Master Mummy. Charge at Barq, and then throw out a grab. If they continue blocking, they'll get grabbed. If they punch to counter your grab, Barq can still hit them with his fire glove for 70 damage and a knockdown. Or they need to jump and dash, which certain arms can also punish. To summarize, Byte Barq have very good tools to deal with opponents who block, so make sure your opponents want to block by constantly punishing their movement. Barq's other main use is to provide Byte with both a means of mobility and protection, because Barq allows Byte to jump on top of him to use him like a trampoline. To do this, simply do a full jump towards Barq, and he will track your position and go underneath you. You can also just air dash onto Barq. Sometimes when Barq is on higher ground than Byte, it can be difficult to jump on Barq. In these cases, you either will need to do both a full jump and an air dash, or you'll need to make Barq move to a better position. From here, you'll start doing small bounces on Barq's head. Every time you do this, Barq will deflect all nearby arms, and Byte will get a short charge for his arms. If you're holding the jump button when you land on Barq's head, you will do a high bounce, giving you a massive height boost and charging your arms for the whole duration. On the other hand, if you're only holding the dash button and not the jump button when you land on Barq's head and move in any direction, you can do a dash bounce. A dash bounce increases your airspeed dramatically, making it about the same speed as Kid Cobra's. The combination of all these options means that Byte and Barq actually have plenty of aerial movement options as long as they stick together. Utilizing the dash bounce can be an especially good way to close the distance or dodge and punish an opponent, while the high bounce lets you rain down charged punches from above. All these great upsides to Barq, but there's something important I haven't mentioned yet. Barq is disabled for 5 seconds when he is hit by a punch or a grab. This can be a good thing since Barq can body block punches and grabs that would hit Byte otherwise. However, when Barq is disabled, Byte doesn't have any other outstanding abilities by himself. This is why it's very important to make sure Barq is either in a position where it's difficult for the opponent to hit him and to bounce on Barq to repel arms coming his way. If the opponent goes out of their way to hit Barq, make sure to punish them while their arm isn't able to hit you. Alright, so now that we have the basics down, I'm going to tell you all the specifics I have found out from playing and testing with Byte and Barq. When Barq attacks, it takes him about 1/3 of a second to actually launch his arm. Take this into account when you're trying to coordinate with him. While Barq's 5-second timer is counting down, actions like blocking, Barq jumping, Barq charging, or Byte being too far away and needing Barq to return to the area in front of Byte can all delay the timer, making the attack happen later. However, if Barq is doing one of these actions when the timer would run out, then his attack doesn't happen at all. To go along with this, you can also delay the attack Barq does 1 second after Byte attacks. The easiest method, and the most useful, is dashing and punching at the same time. The further Barq has to move to get back into range of Byte, the more delayed the punch will be. Again, don't delay the punch too long, or it won't happen at all. One interesting thing about this is when Byte grabs an opponent. If Byte misses, Barq attacks as usual. However, if Byte lands the grab, Barq will start following Byte, which delays his attack, usually until the opponent gets up. This can be very useful when trying to cover your opponent's wake-up options. When high bouncing on Barq, as long as you hold the jump button, Barq will keep tracking your position to allow you to keep high bouncing continuously. If you dash before you start descending from the jump, Barq will stop tracking you. However, if you time your air dash at the very apex of the jump, you can do 2 air dashes before you land on Barq again, using the second air dash to make sure you either land on Barq or to dodge an attack. While doing multiple high bounces, there are certain things that can make it so Barq isn't able to track you properly. These things include slopes, both going up and down them. Depending on the steepness, you can sometimes compensate by moving less during the jump. Obstacles, such as the cars on the Cinema 2 map, tubes on DNA Lab, pillars on the Scrapyard, blocks on Ribbon Ring, and Snake Park in general. Also keep in mind that Barq will generally get stuck behind the tubes on DNA Lab and the pillars on Scrapyard, so be aware of where Barq is at all times on those particular maps. And finally, both attacking and hitting an enemy push you back a little bit, which also can prevent you from doing multiple high bounces on Barq. Since Barq goes in front of your shield when you block, he can interrupt grounded grabs that your opponent might do. You can also set up Barq as a shield to be aggressive. For example, make Barq go in front of you and then dash forward with a punch or grab. Most of your body is protected by Barq, so any arms that end up getting past your punch, Barq can take the hit instead. Trading off Barq to deal damage is usually worth it, especially if you knock them down so that you have time to back off to wait for Barq to get back up. There are several special things about Byte Barq's Rush. When you activate Rush, Barq gets back up if he is currently disabled and attaches to Byte's head. Other than making a combination that looks amazing, this form isn't just for show. Byte Barq have dramatically increased ground speed and dash speed. This makes Byte Barq's Rush amazing at punishing opponents. For example, if your opponent does their rush in reaction to your jump, and you haven't air dashed yet, activate Rush for a very quick burst of movement to dodge and counter their rush. Also, if you block a rush and use your rush while they're recovering, the extra mobility can also help with the punish. The last thing about Byte Barq's Rush is when it ends, Barq jumps off of Byte's head and lands in front of Byte. If your opponent tries to be aggressive after your rush ends, Barq can take the hit for you, and you can punish them. I'm going to run through a few clips of me using the techniques I mentioned earlier, just to give a real gameplay scenario for them. In this clip, I knock down Min Min and decide to bounce on Barq to attack from above once she gets up. I high bounce and then dash to the side to try and throw off her aim. She jumps and then tries to hit me with the Ram before I land on Barq. Since my first dash was at the apex of the high bounce, I can air dash again, and I dash backwards and throw out a punch to make my landing safe. Once I bounce on Barq, her other punch is deflected, and I follow up for an easy punish. Here, I'm fighting a twin tail, as I have the high ground above her. The nice thing about this position for Byte Barq on Scrapyard is, as long as you stay close enough to the ledge, Barq will still punch at your opponent, even with him being below you. The effect of this is twofold. For one, Barq can't be hit by your opponent, because your opponent's camera is centered on Byte. And second, this makes Barq attack from a very different angle than you are, making it more difficult for your opponent to avoid. When things get dangerous, you can even drop down to bounce on Barq. And also, you can bounce on Barq from the low ground to immediately get on to the high ground and set up this desync between Byte and Barq. My opponent is using a Thunderbird, so that can be a big problem for Byte and Barq. Curve arms hit at an angle that can easily hit Barq, so it's important to keep an eye on your opponent's curve arms. Here I see my opponent's Thunderbird coming towards Barq, so I jump on Barq to repel the arm and follow up for a punish. In general, be careful when your opponent is trying to hit Barq, but if you can jump on Barq in time, you can easily get a punish. I jump against an Ninjara, and we both have Rush, so he activates Rush to punish me. However, I have enough time to activate my Rush, and the additional dash speed and distance lets me punish his Rush. Keep in mind, some rushes are too fast or too big to dodge at close range, so you should keep on the ground and block against those types. Similar to protecting Barq from curved arms, here I clash with both the Siki and the Ram, which allows Barq to attack back at the opponent while you focus on defense. But try to always be in a position to help Barq, unlike here where I was not able to stop the Siki from hitting him. To play alongside Barq effectively, keep in mind that Barq will shoot directly at the opponent. In this wake-up situation, I shoot my arm off to the side to catch a dash, while Barq shoots directly at where they are. I still have my other arm to react to other options my opponent has, and I cover two wake-up options at once. Here I'm stuck in the corner, but Barq is able to punch along with me as soon as we get up, since Barq's attack timer isn't active. Using that, Barq hits Twin Tail and I have an opening to move and start bouncing on Barq. The most important thing here is I'm using the short bounce, which can be hard to punish with the frequency that the repel from Barq happens. The other types of bounces can be bad options when you're in a corner, so using the short bounces can help you keep pressure on your opponent while being protected by the repel. There are plenty more scenarios I could go over, but I'm sure you all get the point by now. Byte and Barq get labeled as low-tier gimmicky characters with an unpredictable AI companion, but hopefully this video lets everybody know that is very far from the truth. I imagine incorporating all these different mechanics into actual play will take a long time, and because of that, it will also be a long time until we see the true power of this character. Remember, this video isn't a strict guide on how to play Byte and Barq, but rather its purpose is to give people the tools to develop their own way of playing as the meta progresses. Thanks for watching, but before I end the video, I would like to thank these people from my Byte and Barq Discord, which you can join using the link in the description. These people have been active in trying to develop and discuss the character, and I can't appreciate it enough. So thanks to Sleepy, Shamer, Valentine, and Lapsy, and of course anybody that joins in the future and does the same. See you guys next time!